Here's an incriminating fact about me. Ever since I started playing Baldur's Gate 3 in Early Access, Gale was always my least favorite companion.
Fact 1.
By a wide margin.
Fact 2.
Like, it wasn't even close.
Don't let his bluster fool you.
I call that fact incriminating because I feel like you can tell a lot about a person based on the characters they're drawn to and the ones that they keep at arm's length. So feel free to draw conclusions about who I am as a person based on everything I'm about to disclose to you in this video. I feel like I tell on myself more and more with every new upload. It's worth mentioning that the Early Access version of Gale I was introduced to is fairly different from the man we eventually got in the full release, and we will be talking about that. But no matter which version I was dealing with, Gale as a character has always annoyed and sometimes even enraged me during my many playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3. He was the weak link of my team, an irritating presence that interrupted my enjoyment of the story. And while I was comfortable with that reality, some people in my life and commenters on this channel tried to convince me to give Gale another shot, and so begrudgingly, I did. I did something I'd never done before. I completed a Gale romance run, and while I didn't have time for an origin playthrough, I did watch all the relevant scenes. In the last month, I have consumed more Gale content than I ever wanted to, and I'm here to say that I was wrong. I am officially an ex-Gale hater, and I want to share with you all how and why my opinion changed, but also, and perhaps more importantly, why I disliked him in the first place.
Let me play the devil's advocate.
I want to address what I still believe to be the weakest parts of his character, and I'd like to offer up my own ideas on how he could have been written differently. Because while I have grown fond of our resident wizard of Waterdeep, I can't help but feel as though he could have been better, and that Larian dropped the ball on a few of his most integral plot beats, including the very end of his story. If you've ever spoken to Gale, then you're accustomed to long rants, and that's what this video is going to be. So sit back, hang out, and be prepared for spoilers for all 3 acts of Baldur's Gate 3 as we investigate Gale and do some reimagining of his story. In order to do all that, we're gonna have to start at the beginning, in Early Access, because first impressions matter, but also there's some bleed between the Early Access and full release versions of Gale, and it contextualizes some of the issues that I have with him. Part 1. Gale versus Dale. So the Baldur's Gate Reddit community likes to call Early Access Gale Dale because he looked like this. And I firmly believe that if Gale looked like his Early Access self in the full release, people would be less inclined to like him right off the bat. Gale is the English lit teacher you and your friends crushed on in school. Dale sells stolen motorcycle parts out of his cousin's dilapidated garage. That is called pretty privilege, my friends, but let's be honest, both work for me. Dale's story is mostly the same as what we got from Gale in the full release, save for one detail we'll address in a moment. But first, for those who need a refresher, Gale's full release story essentially boils down to this. A very powerful wizard gains the attention of the goddess of all magic. Being literally seduced by power, he falls in love with her, but his desire for more drives him to pursue a lost fragment of the weave. It embeds itself in his chest and manifests as a literal bomb, and if he doesn't munch on some magical artifacts,
I will erupt.
Oh, and his goddess breaks up with him. He is then kidnapped by mind flayers and hurled onto some beach on the Sword Coast, where he's quickly taken in by a party of mostly empty-headed dummies who are expected to save the world from the encroaching Illithid menace. Later, Gale's mentor and world-renowned wizard Elminster shows up, tells him his ex wants him to for the good of the world, and then dips. Then, Gale discovers that the main villain of the game is wearing a fancy hat called the Crown of Karsus, which could feasibly be used to give someone the power of a god. And the bomb in his chest is actually Karsus's weave, a stolen bit of magic that was corrupted when Karsus tried to turn himself into a god. Gale has one more conversation with his ex-girlfriend where she demands Gale give her the crown, and from there, his story has 4 main possible endings. He can unleash the power of the bomb to destroy the Absolute once and for all, ending his life in the process. He can bring his goddess the crown and win back her affections. He can use the crown himself to become a god and possibly also embrace the power of the Absolute. Or he can discard the crown and use his vast knowledge and magical abilities to teach the next generation of wizards as Professor Dekarios, Blackstaff Academy's illusion magic master and cat dad. Obviously, in Early Access, we weren't in possession of the full story, We only had an unfinished version of the first act to work with, so there was no Elminster, no crown, and no Mystra conversation. Early Access Dale called himself a prodigious wizard of much acclaim, and like Gale, he hoped to impress Mystra and prove himself worthy by finding the Lost Weave. But unlike Gale, Dale was originally spurred to action because Mystra broke up with him, which is an interesting and peculiar difference. In the full release, Mystra doesn't actually end things with Gale until after he's saddled with the magical bomb. He was simply dissatisfied and greedy for more power, despite literally sharing his bed with a goddess. Dale, on the other hand, was a heartbroken young lover looking to win back the supposed love of his life and the living embodiment of his potential. I wasn't actually a huge fan of this change originally, but I have since grown to really like it. It makes the full release version of Gale a more active participant in his own fate, and I think it better ties into his story's themes of pride, ambition, and humility. But just imagine him doing all of this while looking like the rejected third Dixon brother. So while his story remained largely the same, there were several notable differences personality-wise between Gale and Dale, which were tweaked throughout Early Access. For instance, rather than needing the player's help to pull him out of the sigil circle, Dale simply appeared in front of us with his hands confidently on his hips, and he expressed that he was surprised to see us alive, since he apparently saw us on the Nautiloid, passed out in our own blood while being gnawed on by an intellect devourer. If your reaction to that information is to wonder why he didn't help us, that was my first thought as well, especially considering he's outright polite and friendly to us through the rest of Early Access, and approved of all heroic actions. There was also a camp cutscene wherein Dale tried and failed to perform a simple spell. He was visibly angry and evasive, but a few past persuasion checks told us everything we needed to know about that whole business with Mystra. He boasted about his previous abilities to perform dazzling magical feats, and expressed frustration in his lessened power, even likening his mastery of magic to being akin to godlike prowess.
It's just that I am no longer able to perform those feats even arch-wizards would marvel at. To have one hand on the pulse of divinity.
For the record, I wish we had kept this scene in the full release. I think it's really interesting to watch him struggle like this when he's usually so put together when it comes to his use of magic. This really illustrates the impact his choices have had on him, and it gives us an in-canon reason for why a supposed archmage is level 1 at the start of the game, but anyway, I personally found Dale off-putting because he seemed like the least honest member of our party. And I know that sounds silly when we had a secret vampire spawn and an undercover Sharan cultist in our midst, but neither of them were putting on airs as if they were friendly and trying to get to know us. They deliberately kept their distance. Add to that Dale's assumed posture of superiority, and I was just totally turned off. There were no cults or 100 years of torment that he could blame his behavior on. He didn't come across as a damaged soul that needed to be healed. At the time, at least for me, he just came off as a simple mortal man who, from an early age, was told he was special, and he believed it and acted accordingly. And I think we all know people like that in real life. Overall, there was a sort of sinister and arrogant edge to Dale's otherwise upstanding demeanor in Early Access, and as such, a lot of time was spent in the online community theorizing that he would betray the player, or that he was secretly one of the main villains, or something of the like. Of course, those Early Access theories were wrong. A betrayal would not come to pass, but that sinister arrogance would remain even after Gale was reworked to be the wizard that we know in the full release, and that left a pretty bitter taste in my mouth when I booted the game back up on launch day. Part 2. The Duality of Full Release Gale. Let's be honest with ourselves for a minute here. Full release Gale Dekarios, or Gale of Waterdeep as he likes to call himself, is just a more charming iteration of the annoying, nasally voiced know-it-all archetype. He's the blonde kid from Polar Express.
Do you know what kind of train this is? Huh? Do you know what kind of train this is? Well, do ya?
Of course. It's a magic train.
Actually, it's a Baldwin 284 S3 class Berkshire-type steam locomotive.
He talks too much and for too long about things nobody cares about. He makes jokes that aren't particularly funny. He thinks he's smarter than everybody else in the room, and he's bad at reading social cues. All traits he and I share in common, I'm afraid. And yet he's simultaneously this level-headed, hyper-capable man who genuinely does possess an invaluable wealth of knowledge and expects you to have the same confidence in him as he has in himself. In theory, I do think that this is an interesting combination, and Tim Downey, who provides the voice and mocap for Gale, did an incredible job balancing the two halves of the character's personality, lending a low, slow softness to Gale's more serious or introspective moments.
But we've seen hell. It's real. And it isn't trivial.
And an adorable, high-pitched sharpness to his nerdier lines.
Their collection of rare tomes is unparalleled.
But while I'm not saying that those two aspects of his personality are diametrically opposed or anything, I do sometimes find them incongruous. I personally believe that Larian played up Gale's nerdiness because of the feedback that they got from early access players about him feeling like a villain in disguise. In what appears to be an attempt to make him more approachable, they've tacked on this more playful side to his personality. But I think that nerdy Gale ultimately works against the main points of his story, especially the issue of his pride. He comes off as a man who doesn't take himself that seriously, which is in conflict with the way he does treat his condition, his past position as an archmage, and his relationship with Mystra. This does not feel like a man whose ultimate lesson is one of humility.
You don't happen to be a cleric by any chance, do you? A doctor? Surgeon? Uncannily adroit with a knitting needle?
Pair this hot and cold attitude with the leftover idea from early access that Gale is just a dude who thinks he's really special, and you might start to understand why I wasn't immediately enamored with him. But just in case it isn't totally clear, let's move on to part 3. Part 3. For real though, why did I hate Gale? While I've made a fool of myself on this channel, basically worshipping problematic characters, the reason that I can grapple with things like Lae'zel's space fascism is because that is a heavily stylized version of a systemic real-world issue, and it's told symbolically through the lens of a single character. There are clear hints at redemption right from the very beginning, and you can set her on the path of righteousness before you even hit Act 2. Additionally, characters like Lae'zel, Shadowheart, and Astarion may perpetuate harmful or even just annoying behaviors at first, but their actions are clear responses to the traumas they've suffered at someone else's hand. From the jump, these are self-evidently broken people who need help picking up the pieces of their lives, and the journeys they go on in the process are genuinely emotionally moving. But as we established at the beginning of Gale's story, I just saw him as a benignly friendly man who thinks he's better and smarter than everyone, and he's so realistically subdued in his issues that I couldn't see a clear path in which those issues were resolved. They were so baked into the core of his character. And this first impression led me to unfairly sideline him. I didn't really give him a fair chance, and I didn't absorb the full intentions of his story. I didn't clock some of the nuances of his relationship with Mystra in Act 1, which we'll talk about later. I didn't appreciate his willingness to self-sacrifice in Act 2 because I could only see the very real part of him that hoped to be a glorious martyr. And by the time he starts talking about the potentialities of godhood in Act 3, I was just rolling my eyes and hurrying through his cutscenes because I thought I knew all I needed to know about this man. And yeah, his polarized personality didn't help. I realize now that some of Gale's attitude is just obfuscation meant to throw us off the scent of his true inner turmoil. That way the rest of the party doesn't see how tortured he really is. Yes, Gale is arrogant when it comes to his knowledge of magic, and he wants to leave a lasting legacy, even if that means suffering an explosive death to do so, but those wants also reveal his biggest weaknesses. His worst nightmare is losing his abilities. He's terrified at the idea of being forgotten, and he doesn't actually want to die. But because Gale is so smug and self-assured on the outside, the freshly heightened sense of humor Larian gave him in the full release didn't come off as genuine to me. It felt smarmy and insincere. If it were up to me and my silly little reimagined scenario, Gale's personality would be something more akin to someone like Thorin Oakenshield, specifically from the Hobbit book and not the travesties we got on screen. In the book, Thorin is a serious, good-hearted, and my bookmark came out. In the book, Thorin is a serious, stalwart, and good-hearted dwarf. He does have an intense greedy streak, and he's emotionally burdened and forced to contend with the more light-hearted comedic antics of the rest of his party. He's the straight man, and that's what makes him funny. And I think that Gale could fit the same profile perfectly. This wouldn't actually be that big of a change. We do get a taste of what this version of Gale might have been like in the full release, via a few really solid lines, one of which has become a favorite of mine in this most recent Gale-centric playthrough.
The meat tastes of rot and sour milk. Your stomach lurches, but your loins tingle.
If what is happening is what I think is happening, and it's because you licked a dead spider, the time might just have come when you and I should split ways. Stop licking the damn thing!
To that end, my reimagining of Gale would see a tweak of his relationship with the rest of the characters, starting with his very first scene. I'd keep the bit about having to pull him out of the portal because I think it's charming and also spiritually similar to Thorin's introduction in The Hobbit, where this enormously important king is squished under a pile of dwarves. But rather than immediately jumping to enthusiastic handshakes and apologies, Gale would dust himself off and try his best to look unbothered by the inarguable indignity he just suffered. He'd ask after a healer and thank the player for their help in that polite yet warm tone Tim Downey already employs in the full release.
Oh, but before you think you're about to embark on a journey with most ill-mannered a man, thank you for pulling me out of that stone.
He'd tackle most interactions in a similar way, only breaking from his prim and proper self-importance for the occasional gag when Tav or one of the other characters says or does something unhinged. He'd remain friendly, but distant. Not smug, just reserved. A true stuffy academic. At least until he starts to trust you. Once the walls come down, we'd close that distance and see a much more sincere version of Gale. One who shares and laughs with the party and offers details about his life, his goals, and his fears. I think that this approach would make him just as likable without sacrificing the gravity of who Gale is and what he's going through the way his nerdier side sometimes does. That's not to say that nerdy Gale isn't a worthwhile inclusion. I do think that Larian were correct in assuming that they needed to give Gale a personality overhaul from his early access self. And honestly, this kind of character should be catnip for someone like me. A curious, awkward, artistic intellectual who rambles excitedly about his niche interests while harboring an obsessive inner darkness, that's like an ideal man. It's as if Larian and Gale's lead writer, whose name is on screen because I can't pronounce it, wanted the dorky best friend and hot professor trope all rolled into one, which is probably why I only really grew to appreciate Gale's duality during my most recent romance run. And why I think that much of his nerdier side should actually stay hidden behind his romance-relevant cutscenes and dialogue lines. Allow me to explain. Part 4. We're off to kiss the wizard. Whether or not we stick with my reimagined tweak of Gale's more general personality, I still think that his nerdier side should be saved for moments of flirting and intimacy, because during my romance run, I really did fall for nerdy Gale. The moment it clicked for me was right here.
It's quite thrilling to fight off such grim creatures as this region throws at us, especially being at your side. I once read a book that explained in some detail the effect a brush with danger has on one's desire for other forms of stimulation. Have you ever read anything on that subject?
Smoothly noting the thrilling nature of fighting side by side, coupled with the extreme inelegance of asking if I've ever read a sex book, was just so incredibly cute and silly. The juxtaposition of the two sides of his personality worked significantly better for me when I could believably tie his dorky and awkward behavior directly to him being nervous around someone he was interested in. That's such an endearing idea, and I think it adds a lot to his character. It implies that he's afraid of getting attached to someone else after he was burned so badly by his previous relationship. And then when he attempts to woo you with these grandiose displays, it's all the more meaningful, especially if you turn them down in favor of a more down-to-earth romantic outing. Because you come to realize the intimate truth, that outside of Gale's scholarly pursuits, he isn't actually all that confident.
I'm many things, but Koi's not one of them. This is all a bit much for me. Back home in Waterdeep, I prefer to have Tara leave the room before I undress.
It all reminds us that he is ultimately just a human being. Despite all the bravado and talk of great power, he's just a man, which is perfectly in line with the themes of the rest of his story. Okay, let's address the Hollyphant in the room. Yes, I did romance Gale as Alfira. Yes, that does mean that a future video about Alfira is coming. But I also think that it just kind of works. Like, if anyone is going to fulfill that hot for teacher trope, it's gonna be Elphira. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get back to locking lips with the Wizard of Waterdeep. Romancing Gale gave me a new appreciation for his entangling with Mystra. I mentioned earlier in the video that early access Dale got broken up with by his goddess, and that's what pushed him to recklessly search for the stolen bit of magic, and that I think it was a good idea to change it so Gale pursued the stolen magic out of pure greed, obsession, and ambition. But the one issue that I do have with that change is that it makes Gale sound like an impulsive idiot with way more power in his relationship with Mystra than he actually had. And that kind of softens the reality of his situation. Gale reverently defends Mystra in the early acts of the game because he doesn't see how one-sided that relationship actually was, and you can't push back on it until Elminster shows up to deliver Mystra's message right before we depart for Act 2. Make no mistake, Gale's relationship with Mystra is just as messed up as Will's relationship with Mizora. Actually more so, since Will in the full release canon doesn't appear to have been physically intimate with his patron. And Gale only realizes as much in Act 3 when we go to the Stormshore Tabernacle and confront his goddess/ex-lover. Afterwards, we get this line.
She contained universes. But now, it's hard to see any redeeming qualities in a lover who condemned you to death.
This feels so much more impactful with a romanced Tav, or in my case, a romanced Elphira.
I'd much rather gaze into your eyes than hers. Yours are capable of tenderness and feeling. No god could ever compare.
Not only has Gale finally come to understand that he was mistreated, but he's also found love and acceptance in someone else. Someone who likes him for who he is as a person. And later, when he takes us on a trip down the literal astral sea and tries to convince us to allow him to reforge and use the Crown of Karsus to ascend to godhood, the moment feels genuinely weighty in a way it doesn't on a non-romance run. It was the first time I really believed Gale is an archmage, and he makes a compelling case. I've never really felt persuaded by his argument on a regular run, but here, I could really feel his relentless drive and talent and ambition, and it was inspiring and intimidating. And not for nothing, but I think his romance also provides the best resolution to the idea of him needing to be humbled.
I thought I might take this opportunity to reinvent myself. Or uninvent myself, to be more accurate. You're now in the company of plain old Gale Dekarios, the most brilliant wizard of intentionally limited renown.
His is also the most mature romance in the game, with Gale feeling very much like a man that you could settle down with. And I totally understand why a lot of people find his warmth and emotional availability to be appealing. In fantasy, I prefer my romances to be a little more exciting, but I appreciate husband material when I see it. So yeah, Gale's romance as it stands in the full release is really good. It's super solid, and I'm frankly disappointed in myself for not following through with it sooner, but anytime I'd try, something always stopped me in my tracks. Outside of literally everything else I already outlined, that something was the first potentially romantic moment you can have with Gale, the magic practice scene at camp. I'm sorry for anyone who really likes this scene, but it sucks. I'm sorry. In my opinion. Maybe it's because I almost always play some form of magic user, but Gale comes off as so condescending here. Giving us a lesson on Wizarding 101 is not as cute as the scene makes it out to be, and while I do like how it all culminates, this one line always makes me want to strangle him.
You're channeling the weave. How does it feel? Oh, I know.
In my reimagining, I would absolutely change this scene. There should at least be an alternate version for magic users where they decide to channel the weave together rather than having Gale walk us through the basics of spellcasting. And that's really all I'd change in my reimagined version of his romance arc, which is pretty surprising to me as an ex-hater. But his broader arc does not come out of this video as unscathed, so let's talk about it. Part 5. The Things I Still Hate. I hope you all know that when I say hate, I still love this game, right? I feel like if you've made it this far into the video, then you probably understand that these criticisms are all in good fun, and I'm having a great time talking about one of my favorite games of all time, but I don't know, just checking in. My opinion of Gale's story used to be poisoned by my negative bias towards his character on the whole. I think I've mostly purged that way of thinking now, though. I actually find Gale's dilemma quite compelling, and the heavy use of symbolism in his story is really gracefully integrated. For the most part. I do, however, have some issues with the finer details. One of my more minor criticisms is actually targeted at Elminster. On my previous playthroughs, I liked Elminster well enough as that familiar windbag wizard archetype, but given my new appreciation for Gale as a character, I've started to look at this icon of the Forgotten Realms a little sideways. First of all, for the purposes of the story that Larian is telling in Baldur's Gate 3, Elminster is just another jerk with authority over Gale, using their relationship as a means to manipulate him into doing what he wants.
Not true. Not even close. Mistress' ways may seem cold, high-handed, tyrannical even, but she is a goddess.
Elminster was Gale's mentor, and the two of them seem to have a kind of father-son dynamic, with Gale finding Elminster to be kind of an agitating nuisance. And yet, he still makes excuses for him, as he does Mystra.
No doubt she has the power to do so, but as for the permission, Ao would not look kindly on her meddling in mortal affairs. Divine intervention has a tendency to make things worse, not better. As for Elminster, he's saved the realms more times than legend can recount. But to take on a god is no easy feat, even for him.
What I find to be the most interesting aspect of Elminster's role in this story is that he practically is Gale. He's a self-centered, extremely talented, long-winded, curmudgeonly old man who serves his goddess unflinchingly. It's like looking into a mirror that shows us one of Gale's possible futures. That's really cool, and I wish that there was more done with that idea. Ideally, in my reimagined version of the story, Gale and Elminster would have a third and final conversation during the epilogue party scene. And the contents of that conversation would heavily depend on Gale's ending. If he ascends to godhood, then Gale would brag about becoming more than Elminster ever could. If he brings the crown to Mystra, he would commiserate with Elminster about how the two of them are such obedient servants. And if he doesn't bring the crown to Mystra, then actually we'll leave that one as a surprise, because I have more to say about that specific ending. But Elminster is just a minor issue. My more in-depth rantings have more to do with Gale himself. For example, let's talk about the necessity of giving Gale magical items. He requires these artifacts to sate his ambition on a very literal level. He must consume power so that he's not consumed by power, and I love that. However, like Elminster, I don't think that this idea is used as well as it could be, and I know why that is. It's because in early access, players complained that they had to give too many magic items to Dale, and that the items were too good to want to get rid of. So Larian scaled down the amount needed, added in a bunch of junk items to dedicate to the cause, and fully abandoned the idea altogether by the end of the first act. I understand why Larian did what they did, but I still think that this could have been reworked in a more natural way, which lent itself better to Gale's story progression while still addressing the concerns of players who found the mechanic tedious or cumbersome. In my reimagining, Gale's item requirements would be spread out so that he asks for one per act, and each item would have to be more powerful than the last. Metaphorically, that would mirror his intensifying desire to earn back Mystra's favor and return to his former glory. In the first act, you could sacrifice something of uncommon rarity, the color spray ring or whatever, and Gale would thank you, and we would go back to adventuring just as we do in the full release. But rather than waiting until the third item to tell us the truth about Mystra, he would spill the details right here. I think that watching a man break a physical object down into abstract magical energy is reason enough to demand answers, and knowing the reason behind Gale's condition would hopefully ease some players into sympathy for him, rather than annoyance at having to give up their loot.
Gale slurped that thing up like a horse with a carrot.
In the second act, after Elminster shows up to talk to Gale about Mystra's plan for him, Gale would ask for a second item. This one would have to be rare, and he'd say the same thing he does in the full release about it not having the same effect. And at the beginning of the third act, after he fails to follow Mystra's orders to blow himself up in front of the Absolute, he would require a third, very rare magical item. It would barely make a difference in his condition, as is the case in the full release, and Gale would immediately start theorizing on ways he could stop his inevitable demise. Of course, his strongest lead would be the Crown of Karsus, which he just saw on the head of the Absolute, and so that's the direction his personal quest would go. And from there, we'd play all the hits. We'd locate the Annals of Karsus in Leroican's vault. Elminster would show back up in camp to tell Gale to speak with Mystra. He would, and she'd inform him that she oh so graciously decided to keep Gale's bomb stable so he can carry out his new orders, to bring her the Crown of Karsus. Gale would have to decide how he wants his story to end. Will he blow himself up? Will he take the crown to Mystra? Will he use the crown to become a god? Or will he consume the crown? And yes, I do believe that consuming the crown as a means to destroy it should be our final option. In the full release, our last option is to just leave the broken pieces of the crown somewhere in the Chianthar, and that is an astonishingly bad idea. The crown is both a logistical nightmare and a metaphorical thorn in the side of Gale's narrative, because it represents, in a very real sense, power. If I'm allowed to make more Lord of the Rings references in this video, this is just setting up a Smeagol situation, except worse, because nobody knew that the One Ring landed in the River Anduin. Our party in Baldur's Gate knows that the potential for godhood is just sitting somewhere in the water that we just traversed in a submersible. It could very easily find itself in the hands of someone with terrible intentions. I think that perhaps the driving idea behind this ending is that the crown is a sort of reminder that Gale will always have to contend with his lust for power, and that every day is an active choice against pursuing it. But that pull will always be there, lurking literally just beneath the surface. And if that is the idea, then I'm all for it, but I think we could have gotten there in another way. Specifically, I think we could have gotten there by having Gale consume the crown. We already established that Gale has to consume power so he is not consumed by it. He takes magical objects and turns them into useless trinkets. They don't make him any more powerful, they just stabilize the growing insatiable hunger buried deep within him. So what better way to quell his desire, both literally and figuratively, than to consume arguably the most powerful object in the game that could have made him a literal god? And because this is the crown of Karsus being fed to the Karsite weave, the tribute would be enough to put the bomb into a sort of dormancy, which is ostensibly what already happens in the full release if you leave the crown in the Chianthar, but I don't love the in-game explanation.
That's one worry I can leave behind me at least. It could be. Or perhaps the orb's hunger was fueled by my own, and my contentment influences it in much the same way. That's how I feel with you. Content.
While the sentiment is nice, there's a kind of uncertainty there that leaves the narrative needlessly nebulous. And there's a line later at the final party scene, which I think is a bug, where Gale says Mystra definitely did stabilize the orb for him, which I'm not a fan of.
When Mystra quelled the orb at last, she did more than rid me of its threat. She created room for hope, where once I only felt despair.
Having Gale's safety tied to Mystra at the end at all is, in my opinion, enough to constitute a bad ending. Obviously, him embracing the Absolute or becoming the god of ambition are the worst possible endings, but being reliant on Mystra for his safety is also pretty depressing considering how she treated him through the events of the game and before. Consuming the crown would, I think, be a much cleaner slice through all the potential issues in Gale's story, both logical and metaphorical. The crown would be taken off the playing field so it isn't sitting One Ring style waiting to get scooped. Destroying it would also be a gesture which demonstrates Gale's humility, and it would sever Mystra's immediate hold on him. Going back to that Elminster conversation I dreamed up at the final party scene in my reimagining, Gale would finally be able to tell Elminster that he did something his mentor never could. He stood up to their goddess, and while he may never be as powerful as Elminster, that strength of will certainly has to count for something. But because the bomb is still there, lying dormant, it would be that daily reminder of what he so eloquently describes as Gale's folly. It would represent the possibility for power and also the inherent risk such power always possesses. And his role as professor at Blackstaff Academy would be tied into this idea even more than it already is in the full release. He would be teaching the next generation of magic users not to make the same mistakes that he did, which is sort of a nice happily ever after type ending. Or, alternatively, and hear me out on this one, consuming the crown could nullify the bomb totally, but it would sap Gale of the ability to use magic. Hear me out. Hear me out. Part 6. Please just hear me out before you throw me in the stocks. I'm honestly afraid to even propose this idea because I know everyone's gonna hate it, but if I don't make my case, I'm just gonna be thinking about it forever, so here it is. As I already said, I think that having Gale be reliant on Mystra at the end of the game is always gonna feel like a bad ending, and as long as his life is still centered around magic, then in a sense, his life is also centered around Mystra. Would it suck for Gale to lose his powers? Yes. Obviously, like an artist whose hands shake in their old age, Gale would be a tragic figure, but I love a tragic figure, and let's not pretend that none of our other companions make it out of the game without curling a finger on the monkey's paw. Spawn Astarion is resigned to the darkness forever. Shadowheart either loses her parents or must live with crippling pain for the rest of her life, and Karlach has to return to the one place she swore she'd never go back to. And these are their good endings. My only hang-up with this idea is that it may come across to some as if we're robbing Gale of the joy of using magic because it's a thing that's linked to his past abuser. And I do want to be sensitive to that critique. But I also think that it's worth noting that long before Gale was ever involved with Mystra, he already held magic to an unhealthily high esteem. Gale has always conflated his sense of self with magic, and as we addressed earlier, he actively vocalizes his fear of losing his connection to it.
And yet even now, more than I fear losing my own self and soul, I fear losing my command of her art.
So, I think that in order for Gale to truly become his own man and be humbled, the crutch on which he has leaned so heavily has to be taken away from him, and he'd have to find meaning from some other outlet. Without his abilities, Gale wouldn't end up as a professor at Blackstaff, so my pick for that outlet would be his writing. He mentions his poetry early on in Act 1, and during the epilogue party, he also teases the idea of writing a series of novels detailing our past adventures. I think that he could imbue that same bold, creative spirit in his writings as he does with his magic, and this would be a skill that he would actually have to put significant effort into rather than just being gifted an innate knowledge at an early age. He would, of course, mourn the loss of his previous art, but I think that he would find something exciting about pursuing a new one. He tells us during the party scene that he almost misses his adventuring days, but that he wouldn't trade his serene life in Waterdeep for anything. And I think focusing on writing, which he could do from the comfort of his library, would be a meaningfully good ending, if not an altogether happy one. But I do recognize that most people want a happy ending, so don't shoot the messenger or whatever, I just had to get it out of my brain. Now that that's out there, I guess that's it. Part 7. That's it. I always end these rants with some kind of heartfelt message about how much I love and adore the developers at Larian for creating a game that's so rich with opportunities for discovery and play. And I still believe all of that's true. But I'd like to end this one by acknowledging my own version of Gale's folly. That I have logged a ridiculous amount of hours into this game, both on Steam and just in my head. For a long time, I thought I knew all there was to know about it, but here I am demonstrating just how wrong I actually was. If there's any lesson to be learned here, I guess it's that we're never really done learning, and we should stay curious, even about things that we're intimately familiar with, because they might surprise us, or we might surprise ourselves. And also, you should lick the spider. In every playthrough.
Stop licking the damn thing!
So yeah, I guess I lied to you guys about this month's video not being Baldur's Gate related. I really was planning on doing something else, but things changed. I am going to be doing that Alfiera video, but it's coming out in October, so September is going to be something different. Maybe The Last of Us, maybe Expedition 33, maybe the Oblivion remaster. I don't really know yet, I'm not totally 100% sure. Honestly, if you're still here, then I'd love to know what you guys want me to cover, because I don't know, nobody stays after the end card. But either way, as always, I am so ridiculously grateful to have you guys around. So thank you so much for coming on this journey with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!